Welcome to Explore, Explain. This is a long-form video and podcast series sharing conversations with data visualization designers and developers from around the world. Each episode explores the detailed hidden thinking behind a single project or a series of related works to explain the what, the why, and the how of the design process. There are some wonderful guests and some wonderful projects to learn about. So let's jump in to today's episode with your host, Andy Kirk.
Hello and welcome to Explore, Explain. This is season number 3, episode number 1, and I'm delighted to welcome Andrea Lau. Andrea, it's great to see you again. It's been quite a while. Thank you for joining me for this episode. For the viewers and listeners, can you briefly introduce yourself?
Thanks, Eddie. It's so good to see you again. It has been years and years since we've seen each other in Sydney. So yes, I'm Andrea Lau. I'm one of the directors and co-founders of a data visualization practice called Small Multiples here in Sydney, Australia. The other founder is Jack Zhao. And I, in particular, work on the day-to-day production of all of the client work and projects, do some training, do some consulting. But yeah, the group at Small Multiples is very diverse, very multidisciplinary team, and we seek to make data useful for people.
Absolutely. And you've been making data useful for people for a few years now, and it's been great to see the growth of the studio of those years. So congratulations to you both for what you've achieved on that front. Now, in this episode, we're going to talk about a project you worked on last year, 2020. And I think we all know what that means. It's about COVID-19. And this is the Socioeconomic Recovery Data Insight Platform from the UNDP. So to begin with, and especially for the listeners who can't see the work that we're talking about today, can you sort of briefly describe what it is, what it looks like, what it's about?
Yeah. So the overall idea of the data platform for UNDP was to be a one-stop shop for policymakers, region and country offices of UNDP all around the world to go in and find useful data in this one place that's reputable and they know has come through a source and some processing that makes it really, really worthwhile for them to use. We were one part of that, doing the data visualization of all of these themes, they called them, or pillars, for example, health, macroeconomic conditions was another theme, for example. We ended up doing essentially what amounts to a whole bunch of interactive maps and charts and different analyses for each of the themes.
As you said, it's a huge undertaking. I know that you yourselves didn't do all the work. It was kind of multi-component platform that was developed, and we'll come on to some of the kind of what I think are kind of interesting challenges about, what do you need to do and where do you sort of back off and where do others people kind of look after that stuff. But I think the first point I think to start with is the kind of origin story of, just how this project even came about. How did it land on your doorstep? Was it something that you tendered for, or were you kind of approached and commissioned? How did the UNDP and you end up working on this?
Well, UNICEF actually were looking for a bunch of data viz and other practitioners around the world to support them. And they do something which amounts to being on a panel. So we tendered for the panel and we ended up being on that panel. But through that, other UN agencies were able to also ask us to prepare proposals for them. So the UNDP approached us through this panel, and it was a very short timeline. We had 2 phases of this project. So what you see is 2 different phases. And the first phase was 2 weeks, would you believe it? When I was, I knew we were going to chat, I had to look back at all of the different timeframes and so forth. And yeah, it was 2 weeks. So I think us particularly being in Sydney, having some people around, it was a very global project. It was quite optimum, I think, for them, for us being there. So we went through a little proposal stage and met people, decided on some ideas that we might move forward with, and that's how we got started.
I see. So that initial phase, is that to sort of scope out a proposal and then that gets invested in. Is that kind of how it works?
Yeah, pretty much.
Yeah.
So they knew in very kind of high level terms what they wanted to achieve. Like I said before, this one-stop shop, reputable sources, country offices, regional people can go in and have a look. And they knew the outcome they wanted to achieve. The ultimate goal was to get different jurisdictions, like countries, involved in the sense of them using the data that was available on the portal. But also contributing data. One of the key things with this platform was that a lot of the COVID data is very high level. It's on the country level. But as all of us know, all of our individual states and jurisdictions and kind of territories and so forth deal with it very differently, have different demographics associated with them. And so the aim with this, big aim of this was for countries to actually be able to submit the more broken down data.
Okay.
And then get better insights from it as well. But so we essentially went through goals and purpose at the very beginning to kind of eke out what they actually wanted before trying to figure out what the solution would actually be.
That's interesting. So in a sense, it was almost kind of although it's a very grave subject, almost a celebration of the data that is available, but then using that to kind of encourage more contributions and to kind of get this, maybe to highlight the gaps, I suppose, as well as show what we've got, and highlight what we don't know, what we haven't got. Yeah. Now,
absolutely.
I know that, you and the team have historically worked on quite a few different projects that would have a nature of kind of NGO, sort of socioeconomic equality. So just again, going back to the prospects of working on this task, I guess it's something that would have just naturally appealed because you've got history. You kind of know the game, they kind of know the complexities, know the relationships with these kind of clients who, aren't always the easiest to work with because there's such a machinery that comes with these kind of organizations. So I guess you were already appealed just because you've worked on similar kind of projects in the past. But what was it about the prospect of working on a kind of COVID-19 type project that you thought, yeah, this is something that we'll definitely invest some time in?
Yeah, I think firstly, it was something coming from the UN, and that looking around the team that we have, and like you alluded to, kind of the history of the work that we've done, we really do try and make things that are for good, that definitely have the positive aspect and impact. And so for this one, it had positive impact. It was also global. And also ended up that working with this global team was also really interesting as well. So despite the very, very late night calls and working on the weekend, and having both of the directors on a project, which is very rare for us, very, very rare for production projects, and having the team be like, we have to do this thing now. And then the next day we would have almost daily catch-ups with them in that first phase. So despite all of that, like you said, very, very happy to have the opportunity to work with an organization like the UNDP and do a high impact project.
And just with regards to the kind of the people involved. So, I mean, we'll come on to your side of the team in a second. I mean, you've already mentioned, 2 directors, let's get all hands on deck sort of thing. What other people were involved from the UNDP side? And was it just sort of channeled through a single person or a single department? And were there any other sort of floating subject matter experts with whom you needed to consult about different things? What were kind of the cast and crew of people involved?
Yeah. So the daily and then later in phase 2, weekly or bi-weekly calls that we had essentially boiled down to 3 or 4 people on the UNDP end that were data scientist, policy, and digital strategist. And so those were the 3 that followed us through the whole project, with one person leading, essentially. But all of them had a voice during the process. And then, like you said, there were other people who kind of came in and they were the subject matter experts. So for each of the themes that you see on the site, like health, for example, there was a theme lead or a
Right.
theme head who was the person who was in charge of knowing everything intimately about that theme, what the data was going to be, what the key statistics were that we wanted to feature, what were all of the defaults with the interaction, what were the goals, and what were the things that we highlighted. So every single person, every single theme rather, had a person that we could go to, and then this core project team who kind of led the whole thing from beginning to end.
I mean, that sounds terrifically helpful, actually, because it strikes me that you've got, in a sense, a clear sense of who's the person, who's the ultimate customer, who will give you the thumbs up to say, job done, good work, thank you, that's finished. But also you've got the domain experts available to guide you, to work with, to collaborate, so that you've got a sense that, you know, you are being faithful to the subject and the data, and that you and your team aren't, you know, misunderstanding what a certain measure relates to, or a certain way to portray certain data sets. Because this is a, you know, as you know, as we all know, I guess, both as consumers and creators, this is a nuanced subject. There's all sorts of little intricacies about the kind of the appropriateness of counting things by numbers, or by absolutes, or per 100,000, per million. You know, there's lots of nuances, and I think that sounds like a healthy sort of client relationship. From your side of things, clearly the two weakness of phase one was right. Let's just kind of get through this. But I think on a broader point, I never know from the outset truly how much work will be involved in a project, and I find it extremely hard, therefore, to budget, to get a sense of estimated time and cost. I mean, was that something that you were able to do with any? You will have had to do it, but was it something that you could do with any confidence or assurance yourselves about really how big is this gig? How much work is involved?
It depends on the project. So specifically with this one, I think because we knew it was UNDP, we knew that it was a high impact project, and we wanted it kind of feather in cap,
Yes.
so to say.
Yeah.
That we were willing to go above and beyond for it. And also because of the subject matter, like you said, and also just the global, like everyone was everywhere. It was so difficult. We kind of had to work late nights and things like that. That was just part of the parcel. But we didn't estimate very well for this, which is fine. I think we were more constrained by, you know, in the first phase of the 2 weeks, like what time was physically available for us. But even in phase two, things change. You don't necessarily have all of the scope upfront either, or you think you have the scope upfront, but actually it changes over time. Or the approach that you want to take. And that was probably one of the key kind of things that we would love to change of this project, is the process wasn't the typical process, because it was constrained by time and other things, that we just had to run it a little bit differently, which meant we weren't able to go the usual route, which blew out estimates again. But yeah, for this one, yes, it was particularly challenging.
And I think there's two things there. I mean, you're absolutely right. The notion of feathering cap, you know, a desirable client, a project that your name is against, especially like, let's face it, when you're living through this pandemic, as much as it's a topic in itself. There can be something about sort of taking a short-term hit for the longer-term gain, but also you don't know how to cost and budget for these things until you've done them. And I guess you can only therefore become more experienced through doing more projects and getting a sense and that fine-tuned sense of, okay, well, this feels like the similar shape to that other project that we did, and here's how that ended up being costed and time committed. So we have to use that as a blueprint and try and just drop that onto this and see if it works out. So yeah, it's only in the rear mirror that you can truly understand, I guess, how much these things end up taking time-wise. The other people characteristics, of course, are the intended audience. And I think it's interesting that, I mean, clearly this is an audience, potential audience of every flavour and every type of person. which in itself brings challenges because it's very hard to then fit one thing that will suit everybody. But did you, local to yourselves or through the UNDP's guidance, did you sort of land on any particular kind of personas or characters of the people that you had in mind for this? Policymakers, medics, just concerned citizens? What were the kind of discussions that you had about that?
Yeah, so we had it very, very upfront. It was probably in our first meeting, and very often is in the first meeting, or the third question that we ask is about users usually. So in this case, it was country officers and regional officers. That's not the way that UNDP call it, but because I don't quite remember. Yeah, essentially people who are responsible for an area like the Pacific Islands, or a specific country. And so it was really for people sitting in those offices that work either for the UNDP or with the UNDP somehow, being able to take insights off the data platform themselves to use, absolutely. And like I said, be able to say, oh, there may be some patches or there's some holes in it from that they weren't able to put into this platform, but actually I have them, or I'm about to launch a survey that's going to collect some of that data and I can contribute it back. Or the idea that regions can collaborate or countries can collaborate and see what their neighbors are doing as well. So that was the main audience.
And when during last year did this take place as a project that you worked on, but also kind of the initial instigation? I'm just trying to sort of position it in the frame of where the pandemic was at that point.
Yeah, it was early days. So we talked at the end of May.
Right. Okay.
And so what we would have been only a few months really into things. But by then the UNDP had released their strategy for going ahead and their 18 months of planning and their recovery plan. So this was formulated off of the back of that.
I think it's interesting, first of all, the fact that it is sort of badged as the recovery. So even though it's back then when we were knee deep in the heat of this pandemic starting almost, but it is sort of framed as a, how do we get out from this and back to some normality? How do we kind of try and get things back on track, which is kind of interesting. It's less sort of panicky and backwards looking and more sort of forwards looking. But also, I'm just sort of thinking back to that time, and I think it's just really interesting to think about the scramble that was taking place by different agencies, different media, to pull together a coherent story of what was happening local to each place, but also globally, because at that point you are starting to compare and contrast with how we're doing compared to them. Are we doing better or worse? And that's still, 12 months on, that's still a huge topic of contention, actually, the legitimacy of comparisons. But I do like the fact that it's something that was to sort of highlight gaps as much as it was to sort of say, here's what we do know, because and we will talk about this shortly about the data, but different counting rules, different ways of collecting and quantifying and categorizing is something that's characterized the data about this subject. Even how you count a death is so diversely and handled, even within regions that are very similar to each other. So it's a kind of fascinating context there. Just some other kind of contextual factors just to sort of continue setting the scene. And I think it's important about the position of it being around May time, because there wouldn't have been a ton of stuff for you to refer to for inspiration, for reference, for we better not do the same as what they've done, because that's just sort of replicating things. What kind of outward glance did you take at what was being made out there in the media by agencies to be inspired by, but maybe to possibly avoid, for things that weren't working well?
Yeah. So you're right. The timing kind of wasn't a good time for us to try and do any kind of comparative analysis, but we also didn't have time to do one either. So it was really off of the back of the client provided some inspiration that they had, things that they were just thinking of. Obviously, Johns Hopkins was one. and the WHO's dashboard as well. But really, we didn't have the breadth or time to look really far beyond that. So it was really just relying on the knowledge that we've built up over the years to try and formulate something.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I suppose, I mean, you know, there were other projects we were chatting about in this podcast. And I'm just thinking about the project you worked on where chocolate was the output, different sweets and different kind of mixtures. And you know, this feels, you know, as far away in nature from that kind of work where it's very, very creatively open to interpret in different ways. And I'm sure there was lots of sketching took place in that. I bet, as you said, by contrast, I bet you pretty much relied on tried and tested methods, reasonable instincts. This needs to be, for example, an interactive map. And we pretty much need to use these kind of interactive features to let people interrogate it. So, as you said, the benefit of what you've worked on in the past surely that sort of muscle memory was a perfect, reliable basis to sort of pursue this.
Yeah, exactly. And I was going back and trying to think of why we got to where we got to in terms of the map and the interface and things like that. And I was trying to figure out where the map idea came from in the first place. And actually, the client had already done some mock-ups.
Right.
So that's another thing, that it wasn't just, you know, there's some inspiration out there. Here's the data. Here's what we want to achieve. But actually, we've thought about this a little bit already in the team, and this is what we think we kind of want. And we also want to do something in 2 weeks. So, so we kind of had to do it. But we did, because often when any kind of client comes in, or a potential client comes in with a preconceived notion or a solution, we try and challenge that. Or sometimes it feels like it's the natural fit, but sometimes we annoyingly, probably for some clients, go, do you really need a map? And they're like, yeah, actually, no. Or actually, what are you talking about? Yes, of course we need a map, kind of thing. So to your question about, you know, finding inspiration, things like that, actually the client provided a lot of initial direction for this project.
You're right. I mean, I have chat to a few people on these episodes, and the ideas that come from clients can be met with both glee, oh, terrific, you've done some thinking, but also, oh no, you've done some thinking, and and yeah, it doesn't always fit. But I think it's fine so long as they're all, as you said, they're open to be challenged. You know, does the where matter? You know, is it about the spatial dimension, or is it about the categorization? So yeah, I mean, it just starts a healthy dialogue. And I guess, as you said, if it's a kind of 2-week rush process, that any starting point that's been done, some thinking that's been done, can only help you kind of accelerate through that. The other quick thing to contextualize the work, obviously the centerpiece is this sort of web application. It's very much a digital solution. A couple of points about that. Were there any printed outputs that emerge from this, or maybe static digitals that emerge from this for, I don't know, like PDF reports, or for people to use to publish on social media, that you have to create separate little deliverables for those? And also desktop, mobile, was it primarily a desktop solution and then you'd compromise or fit it into mobile, or did you effectively have to sort of design 2 separate things, optimum for each?
So no print, no social media output from our side, at least. And from the perspective of desktop and mobile, I sighed a little bit when you asked that, because it was primarily desktop. The idea was that, you know, policy people in offices are using this for work.
Yeah.
So they should be sitting down in front of desktops and laptops to see them. But we still needed to make it accessible for people on mobile, because it's, you know, you want to showcase what the UNDP team have done to pull this all together, and you want to make sure that people are able to at least get a glance of what's there, so that they can make the decision of whether they want to look at it on desktop or not. So we did, in the second phase, build in a responsive version of that, but that was very challenging because we didn't do mobile first, and
Mm.
challenging, but okay in the end.
Yeah. And I think it's right. I think sometimes you have to accept that mobile is the worst platform for certain things because of the size and the fiddliness of it. But also, as you said, it's often a gateway to at least cascade that this thing exists.
Yes.
And if you like it, come over here and let's look
Yeah,
at it on
exactly.
a desktop. But furthermore, what you've said is that the primary audience were people who would be working with it. It's a utility, it's a tool to work with. So it's not something that's just nice. Just kind of walking around the streets, having a little look at this thing. It's got a bit more of a purpose than just that. So that's the context. Now, the data is not an insignificant topic with this.
Mm-hmm.
I guess what is perhaps unique to this project in contrast to others is that you've not just been sent a spreadsheet and said visualize this, or you've not foraged for some data and visualize this. This is visualizations being built on this huge developing repository of data. I mean, I guess in summary, what are some of your headline thoughts about the challenges that you face with working with the data sets that would feed ultimately the visuals that you build?
So this one, usually we are able, like you said, to take a spreadsheet and really think about it, do some analysis on it, or at least know feel a shape of the data and see the shape of the data. Even if we're not the domain experts, we try and become as expert in, the matter as possible. But for this one, too many data sets and too little time. And so we really had to come up with an overarching approach that could apply to any data set that came through.
Yeah.
So that meant that things like having any kind of understanding of all of the data kind of flew out the window, that we were just really, accepting data in a certain structure, making sure that it was, it fit the way that it needed to be structured and ingested into the visualization, and then just put there. Then we checked them, but we didn't check them in the sense of that storytelling kind of narration side of things that we usually do, because this project was more about exploring data than it was about telling specific stories.
I mean, that's interesting. I mean, you're right. You would characteristically get a sense of the shape and the physicality and the number of discrete values and the range of values. And I guess you will have had to do that anyway to get a sense of, what's the highest number on this measure, because we have to create space for that, or we have to create a color ramp that will, cover that eventuality. So it does feel like you've almost had to avoid the temptation to get into the sort of semantic understanding of the data and just feel about, or see it almost as a mechanistic challenge, creating containers that then will feed the machine that you are ultimately developing. But I guess that will also be part and parcel of the relationship that you had with the subject matter experts that you spoke before, because they would have ultimately been the custodians and those responsible for, preparing, gathering and checking the data. And I suppose you have to just sort of keep a distance from even having to worry about that. Is that fair?
Yeah, that is totally fair. Unfortunate in the sense that we would like to extract some things. Like I was talking to Jack about what he would like to say, talking to you about this project. And he thinks that maybe it would have been good if we had time to go into further detail of very specific stories.
Right.
Like women in Bangladesh who have lost employment during COVID, or something like that, and then reflecting data there and telling more of a story through those kind of lenses at a very kind of bottom-up level. Whereas everything that we did on this project was very top-down, which, like I said, is great because we were able to cover a whole big set of data and be able to put them all in different places and change those drop-downs and so forth. So that was very valuable. But it would have been nice if we had time and the opportunity to do some kind of bottom up and little stories.
Yeah, I think that's right. And again, it's I think it often comes down to your own almost self-discipline to not be too tempted to sort of draw into that stuff, because by nature you are communicators and data happens to be the medium that you are communicating with. But in this, I guess, needs most, you've got to get the thing kind of operational and functional. Were there any, and it may not be the case, but were there any particular moments when a certain data value or a certain measurement or a certain metric just caused problems, just tripped up your thinking, or you've kind of got a mechanism working and then this one outlier swoops in and think, oh, blimey, that's going to change how we need to design for that thing? Any particular examples?
It was, the simplest example is, as we all know, the cases around the world is very different. And so every news outlet uses the log scale to visualize that. And so at a very kind of simple level, we visualize cases as circles over the top of countries. And so cases would change day to day. I think at one stage we were showing cases for the week or average cases for the week. And so we had to think about like, well, what if this is too high and so forth? And because some circles would get very small and so forth. That was probably the most of it. And then for the rest of the data, most of it is shown in this kind of choropleth bivariate color palette device. And so we were able to have a little bit more control about scaling with those ones. But it was really the cases that tripped us up at the very beginning.
Sure. And I suppose the other thing with that is, thinking back to the context of when this was being developed, this is an ongoing topic. The data is constantly changing and growing. Well, it's only growing. It won't go down, it'll only grow. So, I suppose you almost have to take this sort of crystal ball future glance about, well, how big could these numbers get to? And, what scales may we need to build in eventually to be able to show these things? Because to your point about big and small, the small doesn't mean that's a good story, because it might just be it's a small region or a very sort of localized story where to them it's a huge deal that this number has happened. But in the context of the US or China or Europe as a whole, it's small fry. But again, the other thing I wanted to just ask about is, well, I suppose you've already kind of answered it in some ways, but you are talking about humans, and you're talking about loss of life, and you're talking about cases and tragedy, and did any of that sort of weigh on your shoulders a little bit about how you were thinking about visualizing it? I mean, we'll talk about colors later on, but when you color these things, it might be a joyful color that you're using, but it's about something that's very grave and somber. And did those kind of emotions of the subjects ever feel that they were kind of creating an incongruence with the way that you were designing anything?
Yeah, I think reflecting on it, there's definitely tension between how we've chosen palettes and which is concerning to me now. But in kind of the thick of it was just something we ran with. Because I guess we were a little bit more removed from the data in this, if I can make an excuse for it.
Yeah.
Is because we were concentrating on these themes, these 5 themes, and trying to kind of identify each of the themes separately, and having this bivariate and bivariate color palette just meant that our color issues were kind of compounded. So yes, I absolutely agree with you. I think there's tension between color palettes that were used here and definitely the data underlying that data.
But to that point, of course, you've also got a functional duty to create separation in color association. So
yes,
there's only so much you can do to keep the somber tones whilst also showing, a dozen different things. There have to be unique coloring. So I guess that's just a fair, rational trade-off that you eventually end up with the colors that you have used. I mean, we'll come on to that in a bit anyway.
Yep.
Just moving on to the kind of, I guess, the content, and before we go into the actual kind of chart choices, the general content. I mean, if you were sort of to have a big whiteboard and some post-it notes to sort of map out the contents that we see. I mean, the structure that you've spoken about already, the kind of 5 pillars: protect people, health first, macro response, economic recovery, and social cohesion. So that is the kind of dominant architecture that the contents are arranged around. Was that always going to be the primary thing that
Yes.
grouped and separated things?
Yes, that was the fixed thing from phase 1 to phase 2.
Right.
Yeah.
So in a sense, that's the immediate entry point, more so than potentially like a country, for example. That's the thematic entry point. And then underneath that, and correct my terminology, but you've got 3 domains, subdomains that are kind of underneath each of the themes. Is that the correct terminology?
Yeah, we called them goals.
Goals, okay.
Yeah.
Pillar goals, yeah. So I suppose in some ways that's already helpful architecture for you to build stuff around. And then within the kind of individual pages for the goals, you've kind of got this this rhythm of some kind of headline, factoids or statistics, and then you've got the interactive map, and then usually an interactive bar chart as well. So obviously there's a headline nature, there's a where's the story nature, and then there's another perspective that's pretty much the same data but just not mapping it to rank stuff. I mean, again, just from an editorial point of view, those contents, were they pretty much well established as the wish list of things to show people from the side of the client when they were approaching you, or did you feel yourselves that this had to be the extent of the things that you were going to show people?
I think it began as I think each of them the client had ideas about at the very beginning. And as we got through the project in a bit more detail and understood the scope of the data, what we had to play with, started getting into line in terms of the structure that was laid out for each of the pillar heads or the goal, the theme, people who were the domain experts for each theme to go through and fill out this structure. As we got that kind of more into rhythm, then this information architecture emerged from it. So the other thing that we talked about with the client, and they had an idea from the very beginning also, but isn't really shown from a user point of view, is underneath each goal are a bunch of questions.
Right.
That the map should answer, or the
Got
map
you.
in combination with a few things should answer. And so that isn't shown because the user doesn't need to know that. But that's how we arrived at those kind of default views of each of the map and so forth. Yeah.
And so obviously one of the approaches that you've had to take this is pragmatism and reproducibility on a scale. Once again, kind of reflecting on things, and maybe this is both your reflections and potentially the client's reflections. Would you have ideally liked to have treated each theme or pillar and goal within that with very bespoke solutions in each one? And the fact that we've got a certain rhythm under each of the goals that we see was, again, a reasonable but pragmatic view to say, right, we need to find a way to scale all this up.
Yeah, I think if we were to do it again, it would probably end up very similar.
Right.
But like Jack's idea is that maybe there's more of an opportunity to tell those individual stories a little bit more. Because it's good that there's consistency between the themes, and there's an expectation as well from a user point of view that what they see in each one is what they get for the next one, and they can interact between them very easily. I think it would, maybe the design might change a little bit or something like that, but the underlying idea and approach and information architecture is probably would remain the same.
Got you. Now, I just mentioned that kind of the first thing that we kind of encounter on these pages is kind of a bunch of main headline indicators or sort of facts and figures. Can you speak to me, and this is with you just as a general visualization practitioner, can you speak to me about the difficulty of just visualizing individual isolated facts and figures? Because I find it the hardest thing. I mean, and it almost comes down to a decoration of a number. It's just really hard visualizing small numbers.
It is, and you don't know whether to celebrate said number
Yeah.
or if it's a bad thing. But usually, I think it can be said for a dashboard, an external-facing public dashboard like this, that typically big numbers, and we would call these factoids,
Yeah.
this kind of summary bar, are usually to feature something that it's just important. If
Yeah.
you need to really kind of see it and make it very obvious. So 71 million people pushed into extreme poverty as a result of COVID-19. You need to know that. So we're going to put it really high up front.
Yeah.
And yes, maybe missing some context.
But it's
but
hard.
that's I guess.
Yeah.
And yeah, it's a little bit for context, I
Mm.
suppose, as well. That they, yes, maybe they can't stand alone very well, but at least they give you context for going into the next thing, for example.
And I suppose, again, in terms of your own kind of creative temptations, when you see something like, 71 million people push into poverty, I think that's the stat you just said. I'm sure there's part of you that says, I want to make this more relatable and shocking and something that's perhaps more human than just a factoid. That has to be the thing that you do. That has to be the treatment. But I'm sure that creatively you're thinking, I want to show 71 million dots, or 71 million as a context of you could fill this many Melbourne cricket grounds or something like that. So I'm sure that's kind of where your brains were going.
Yeah. Sometimes, but not all the time.
Right.
I think in the case of, like you were speaking to, color and the suitability of color for some of these things, I think for this particular dashboard, it's actually okay to make things very objective
Yes.
looking
Yeah.
and unbiased looking, and just present them as they are. We don't, at least for this one, we don't necessarily want to go like, this wasn't your example, but for example, if we did like some little humans as like icons or something, it just starts playing into that infographic space instead that we probably wanted or would like to avoid. But maybe somewhere in between, like your suggestion is maybe, like if we want to pull at heartstrings, maybe photography or something else could be used in this kind of situation that would definitely make it kind of more impactful for people. Definitely.
Yeah, but again, back to your point about the audience, the people using this primarily are not needing to be convinced that this is a huge human issue. It's and I think therefore the treatment that you've given it is entirely appropriate. So just talking about the map next. So the map, we've kind of got a fusion of a choropleth map with a kind of a proportional symbol map overlay. And again, that feels like you've probably had to juggle a few different ideas and about, again, the opposite issue of visualizing isolated numbers is visualizing lots of things simultaneously. What was the kind of evolution of that approach, and were there any other methods you thought about? Spike maps? Don't know.
So we did think about a few things, and we were constrained a little bit by what the client expected, but also by one of their goals, which I haven't mentioned, which was like right now, or at the time rather, in May, the WHO map was there and Johns Hopkins was around. Everything about COVID was very much focused on the cases and fatality rates and so forth, which is totally fair. But like you said before, UNDP suddenly has this, not suddenly, but has this plan, and that's their job. They're supposed to be, the organization who oversees equality in the world and tries to pull people out of poverty. That's their main objective. And so it's their job to look forward at these things and also look at things in different ways. So one of the other goals was really to be able to compare and possibly contrast and correlate data sets which don't usually get compared, so that they could more easily help vulnerable communities. So some examples of a vulnerable community might be one that has not very good access to clean water, or one that doesn't have very good access to the internet.
Right.
But then you need to understand whether that is important in the context of COVID,
Yeah.
which is where sometimes the secondary indicator, that bivariate map comes in, or the overlay of COVID cases on the top of that. So one of in phase 1, we tackled the health pillar first. And the health pillar, if I remember correctly, I can bring it up on my other screen, was about so cases, fatality rate, and also just deaths as an absolute number, was going to be the context theoretically for all themes. It was the underlying kind of foundation. And then each of the themes would have their own data, their own domain data that they wanted to talk about. So health, it was about the number of health professionals per 100,000 of the population, or the number of midwives and people working in maternity wards, and how that was related to, say, cases.
Right.
And the idea was that you could also see, and that's why we chose the bivariate map, was to accentuate countries that were having particular problems in both.
Yeah.
And therefore they were the ones who needed the most help at this time.
Which speaks as well to the fact that this was, again, primarily a kind of exploratory tool to let people try things out and see, is this thing a kind of causing factor, or what's the effect of those two things? I mean, just speaking to the bivariate plot, I mean, it's a quite unorthodox colouring approach, and it's not always seen out there, and it's something that I've seen used quite badly in the past, where the colours just haven't been the kind of appropriate choices. I mean, is that something that they came to you and said, we think this might be an option, or did you essentially eliminate other options and say, well, this has to be the way forward? And therefore, how did you sell that approach to the UNDP?
It was actually our idea. It was a DataViz designer, Dasha's idea. And, off the back of what we were talking about, and wanting to compare two things, that seemed like the natural approach. But we did, because there's only so much you can do on a map without it becoming overwhelming.
Sure.
And we didn't really have many. If we wanted to visualize 3 things at the same time, we didn't really have much choice.
That's
almost. But if we wanted to also maintain some consistency, so at some stage we said cases being circles overlaid on the top, we fixed that. That means no more stuff on the top. Or if we do put things over the top, that means we have to switch out cases for something else.
Yeah.
And so then it became, well, we have fill, we have stroke. Maybe we can't really use stroke because that's just all borders, because that's just too much. And it just fell to it that the idea of the bivariate worked, with the idea of like how we sold it to the client. Was that idea of, look, we can visualize these two things, and where they both end up really saturated, or this particular color, that's where you have to concentrate on. And so I think they really liked, but they did have to be kind of brought around to it, but it didn't take too much convincing. I think they did like the idea, appreciate the thought behind it.
Well, I think there's two things there. There's the fact that you can demonstrate that there's a process of elimination, that there's nothing else we can do if we want to show this thing. So if you are anchoring that this thing is the thing to show, then we need to find the least worst way sometimes, let alone the best way. And as you said, you've used up the overlay. The region outlines are going to be too fiddly and invisible for very small countries, let alone the fact it might just look like a country outline anyway. So what you've got left is kind of opacity, you've got texture, and that just won't work as well because there isn't enough scope to do. So we've tried all options. This is what's left. But let me assure you, Mr. Client, Mrs. Client, that if I teach you how to look at it, so concentrate on that top right corner, the most vivid blend of the two metrics, and look for those on the map. And so, you can coach people to train themselves to look at it. Because otherwise, people just blast onto the map and say, right, look at all these colours. No idea what's going on. Right. tackle it in small
Exactly.
chunks. Just look at bits by
Yeah.
bit. And so, yeah, I do think it works. And there's a couple of articles that I've kind of bookmarked, which I'll share in the show notes from people like Josh Stevens at NASA, who's talked about bivariate plots in the past, and about their strengths and weaknesses and the techniques that work best with them. So I totally kind of endorse the fact that that's just the best way to show it. Below that, then we've got the bar chart, and again, this is almost a different viewpoint of the same data that you've selected to sort of show things by rank. The Human Development Group is the colouring applied in most cases to those bars. What does that relate to?
So the Human Development HDR, what does R stand for? I should know this because we just did work with them. Anyway, the HDRO out of UNDP release a report every year or couple of years around what are the kind of challenges that we face as a society. And one of the fixed things that they update every year is the Human Development Index, which is a measure of a whole bunch of things of put together. But what happens is that according to the number that a country gets, it ends up in one of the human development groups.
Right.
So the idea here is that we should focus on low and medium human development group countries because they're more vulnerable at this time, and help them to and support them with policy changes and whatnot.
I see. So something a bit more sophisticated than first world, second world countries as a sort of stratification method.
Oh yes, I hope Hans Rosling would approve.
Absolutely. There's another section on the site, which is this access all data interactive. Now, is this something that you also pulled together as a separate interface for people to explore the data?
I don't know. Let me have a look. No, it's not.
Okay.
It's actually, so the data scientist that was working on this project for UNDP, she did this,
right?
But we worked in tandem. So because this project, like you said before, was rather large, we were one part of it. There was lots of other things going on, and also they wanted to do a lot and achieve a lot as well. So they did a lot of work in parallel. And the idea with this one was that I believe it actually shows you all of the metrics across all of the pillars, so you can do whatever you like with it.
Right.
So whereas ours was already quite exploratory, this one is like far out exploratory.
Yeah, and I was wondering if it was part of your remit, because it obviously has some characteristics. You've got the bivariate, you've got the kind of interactive features that you've offered elsewhere, but the fact that it wasn't necessarily your own development, I think, is a testament to how cohesive all this feels to the outside. And I know that you will have done some bits, and other parts of the group will have done other bits, and yet it feels uniform. It feels quite harmonious, which is challenging as hell to do that.
Yeah, and yeah, absolutely. I think this was testament to the data scientists who worked on it, who she didn't need to take our kind of approach on board at all, but she did, and yes, that means it's more consistent, which is great.
Yeah. So to move on to some of the other design choices that you've encountered. I mean, we've already spoke about the kind of interactiveness of the pages, where you can choose multiple indicators, and then you've got the animation feature to see how it's kind of unfolded over time. You've also got classic elements like tooltips to get a few more details. Were there any other interactive techniques that you were considering that you didn't use, or you would have liked to use, but realistically you couldn't employ? I mean, that feels like the classic headline menu of things that you would do, but any other things you attempted or experimented with?
I think the interactivity between the global map and an individual country was something that we would have liked to go further,
Right.
but that's a separate page, which made it hard to do. But other than that, I can't think of anything off the top of my head.
Yeah. I mean, as I say, it feels like the most logical interactive events that you'd want to interrogate the data with at that point. And obviously, there's a few different ones in the active interactive that we just mentioned about accessing all the data, because you can do things. I think it's the technique called linking, where you highlight one thing in one chart and it shows you the equivalent value in a different chart. But that's not necessary in the stuff that you worked on. The annotations, I mean, there's a lot, of course, of the classic apparatus of labeling and value labels and axis scales and headings and stuff. And to what extent did you also have to author any of the copy, any of the text that is sort of wrapped around the descriptions? Again, is that something that you would have kind of created space for, but leave them lot to actually fill it in with the content?
Yep, exactly. So I think maybe for the first phase, we were given some copy, some of it we had to kind of figure out. But for the most part, we had some placeholder text to play with for the design and then for the first implementation, and then left room for the client to go in and, rewrite things. So that's from like a content point of view, but there are some other bits that were just about, wording, choose an indicator to color regions, that kind of labeling, which is nothing to do with content or copy, but more just like, is the UI element telling you the right thing kind of thing. There was lots of that going on as well, and making sure it fit in the space and those kind of things.
That's it,
yeah.
I mean, I always bang on about this, but words have a spatial consequence, and fitting labels and fitting in little headings and instructions like that, it's awkward, because you want to be brief and concise, but you've also got to think, well, is this truly explaining the thing that you can do with this feature or what it relates to? So it is a challenge, definitely. And I noticed elsewhere, and I suspect this is what you worked on, but there's a nice how to use this website video, which I thought was quite a useful feature to give people. I mean, it's 3 minutes long. It's quite an in-depth guide, but again, I think it's a useful wrap-up, although the people using it primarily will have sufficient knowledge of what to do and why they're doing it. But just to wrap up those other people, maybe kind of more passers-by coming onto the site, I think it's kind of helpful to give that just backup option of explaining the how to use it feature. And then on to, I mean, we've covered color to a decent degree already. I mean, I do, when I looked at this piece the other day to prepare for the conversation today, I did sort of notice there's a lot of things that need to be colored, and I did sort of feel the pain that you must have gone through, thinking, well, we've used red for that, so what can we use now for this? And I mean, the pillars themselves, I mean, I assume that those 5 colors for the 5 pillars are already committed, because it's the the kind of guidelines that will have exist for how the UNDP communicates those things. So you're thinking, well, how do I find new colors? I mean, not to go into too much detail, but what are some of the headline reflections on the difficulties and the wrangling that you went through with trying to find the colors?
We had a palette given from UNDP. So we used that as much as possible. First we had to filter out ones that were too similar. I believe we tried not to use red, I think because it was like too signaling as bad.
Semantic, yeah.
I believe we did that. And then it was, trying to make them just different enough from each other. But it's funny how much of design is just, crossing off the things that you can't do, and what you're left with is what you're left with, essentially. But this one with the color palette, I think the most kind of manual piece of work that we did was we actually defined each of those 25 squares.
Right.
When there are 2 colors, we define every single color in those individually, rather than letting it just blend normally from what I remember. Yeah.
Got you. And I mean, did you have to, was there any kind of pushback with the client? You're saying, I need to introduce a new color, and they might say, oh, you can't use that because that's not in our palette. Were there any of those conversations?
Okay.
Yeah.
No, it was fine. They were very good with this.
No, that's healthy. I mean, that suggests that they kind of get the fact that, kind of corporate colors are primarily to serve a purpose of marketing and identity and consistency, but then there's got to be a little bit of scope for the visual treatment, which for which there are rules and there are
Yeah.
rights and wrongs, of course.
Yeah.
From a layout point of view, of course, we've got the kind of architecture of that we've spoken about, the pillars and the goals, and then the headings, map, bar chart structure. I mean, beyond, we spoke about the labeling issues there as well. Were there any other sort of sizing, placement, allocation of space issues or compromises that you felt were just kind of a niggle to kind of resolve?
It's like you feel like you know that there was one.
There's always one. There's always at least one.
We were asked to fit the map and all of the indicator drop downs on a screen.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
So all in one view, on one of the laptops that a country officer would have,
Right.
kind of from UNDP, which is totally fair, but was very constraining. It means that the map's kind of very, very tiny.
So what would that be? Would that be kind of 1200 pixels, 900? What were the kind of rough? It does feel a challenge.
I can just take a screenshot. It was probably roughly 1300
okay.
by 700.
Right.
And the 700 height was the killer for this one. Totally happy to do it if requests, and we did try and push back. We did it at the very, very last minute. Like we kept kind of pretending that the request didn't exist, and then we eventually did it. And I think if the people using it, are finding it useful that it's in this spot, then it doesn't matter what the designers think about it.
And just out of it, what's the map projection that you used? And is that something that you had to be sensitive to?
I think it's just a Mercator projection.
Right.
I think we didn't. No one asked us about the projections, but there were sensitivities around. We weren't allowed any country labels.
Right.
We had to be very careful around boundaries and where we got the boundary file from.
Okay. Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, did the UNDP have their own that you can just resort to?
The UN has one. Yeah.
So you don't have to go through the struggle of the sensitivities around. I mean, what is a country sometimes is not as straightforward as you'd expect it to be. But if they've got that sorted, you can obviously just fall into their slipstream for that.
Yep, exactly.
And actually, a point I forgot to raise earlier on about the data, but you've mentioned now about the sort of sensitivities about political sensitivities, cultural sensitivities. Were there any politics involved in any of the data? I mean, I know that having spoken to someone like John Byrne-Murdoch about his work on the Financial Times tracker, there were data published officially that would be questionable, and then when he speaks to kind of more local correspondents, they will give him a more accurate data file. I know that you weren't necessarily involved in the weeds of that kind of collection side of things, but were you having to just tread a delicate line with any of the data contents from that side of things?
No, we were saved from that a little bit. I think for us, at the end of the day, there was, there is rather a UN data set that defines what they view as the countries. And we use that as our kind of canonical list. Like I said, they also gave us the boundary files, so that was fine. Although we just, so we were shielded from that, and we could always say, oh, we've got data. Sometimes we would have a mismatch of what the data had in it and what the UN country data list would say. And so in that case, we just go, not in the list, so we're not going to show it. And everyone was fine with that.
That's clear cut. Brilliant. I mean, just to sort of wrap up things, I mean, people are always curious about the kind of technology that you've used. I mean, what would be the kind of headline stack that you've used to kind of work on this?
It's all React.
Okay.
So JavaScript. It's pretty much all bespoke.
Right.
As well. There's also D3, obviously, particularly for the map. And then we use Figma a lot as well for the design process. And a lot of Miro as well. Or a little bit of Miro in this project. It was mainly fueled off of Figma and React.
Yeah, sure. I must admit, in conversations with people, these are increasingly common mentions. React,
Yes.
Figma, it's certainly becoming a trend, I think, in terms of dominating the landscape. Right, well, closing reflections then, Andrea. I mean, looking back now, there's a bit of distance from when you worked on this. I mean, you've talked a lot already about the things that you'd, I guess, in a kind of context-free environment, you would have liked to do X and Y, but did you enjoy it?
Oh,
the
yeah.
project? Yeah, and as a team.
Yeah, definitely. I think we're extremely proud of the work. We were running on adrenaline, especially that first phase of that first 2 weeks. I literally did not remember it being that fast. I went back,
Wow.
like I said,
Yeah.
in preparation. I went, really? We did all of that in 2 weeks. I can't believe it. Not to toot our own horn or anything like that, but it's just it kind of shows how I think we, in the moment and that, running on adrenaline we were. I was also like, it was just amazing during COVID, during remote, during lockdown, to be able to not only work with our internal team completely remotely, but also this team who at one stage we had a call with one person in Auckland, another in, at least in Bonn, London,
Right, okay.
New York, and then us in Sydney. And also the people who we met doing it as well. All these UNDP folk who are just, I think they're doing a great job, and so that was really lovely to be able to meet all those people.
It sounds like a really positive experience then. What's your favourite bit? And is there a feature or a little flourish or a little moment where you think, I'm really happy with how that turned out, or really happy with how we reconciled the best solution for that thing?
I think the bivariate color palette was a standout at the beginning, just like, cool. Well, nice, we're going to do that. So that was like I mentioned, I think the people were a little bit of a favorite part for me as well. And then we didn't mention it, but we used, from the data perspective, we used Tableau Prep for like everything to manage this data. It's not, if you look under the hood, you don't look under the hood of this project, because it was supposed to be this kind of more proof of concept, first, second phase, and to be developed into, supported by bigger infrastructure. But it kind of at first ran off the back of Tableau Prep. So seeing Jack's huge Tableau Prep file was also one of my favorite things. As well.
All this piping of the different sources,
it's incredible. Yeah,
fantastic. Well, thank you, Andrea. That's been a wonderful tour through that project. I'm delighted to have heard of the backstory to it, because it's the sort of thing that I think from a passerby, you don't appreciate all the different things that people have to go through to build these, huge repositories, and with such flourish and such flair. So great job on the project itself. Congrats to the team, and thank you for sharing your insights. Thank you to everyone who's been watching and listening, and we'll see you again soon for another episode of Explore Explain. Thank you. To see more information about today's episode, including some links to key sites and resources mentioned, please visit my website at visualizingdata.com. Here you'll also be able to find details about my book, information about my public and private training courses, as well as over a decade of blog posts. If you've enjoyed this series, please consider liking, subscribing, and spreading the word. See you next time.